They mocked her torn shoes when she stepped into town each morning, carrying nothing but a satchel of lesson books and a quiet determination they mistook for weakness. The sun always rose behind her as she descended the winding trail from her tiny wooden cabin, casting a long shadow that no one ever paid attention to. The townspeople called her the valley's poorest teacher. They said she belonged to no one, a girl with no roots, no family, no future. They didn't see how she walked with purpose. They didn't know that behind those humble eyes was a secret stitched into her very bones. Miss Eleanor Grace had taught at the Hollow Creek School for nearly 8 years, arriving just after her 19th birthday with a certificate in one hand and a suitcase full of hope in the other. Her parents had died before she turned 10, and her grandfather, the last living relative she had, passed away before she finished her teacher training. She inherited a dilapidated cabin on a ridge too steep for most to climb, and for years she made do with what little she earned. The children adored her, and parents grudgingly respected her. But no one offered her more than a nod in public. She was the valley's ghost, floating through their lives with kindness and calloused hands. In the town square, whispers circled faster than dust in the wind. At Charlie's general store, over warm biscuits and bitter coffee, old men chuckled about her ragged coat. Women glanced her way with pity, then returned to their gossip about land prices and cattle herds. The valley had grown rich in the last 2 decades, rich off orchards, mining rights, and tourism. But Eleanor never asked for more. She graded papers by candlelight, wore patched dresses with pride, and wrote lesson plans late into the night beside a stove that hissed with dying embers. One morning, as clouds hung low and the world felt quiet with the weight of coming rain, Eleanor stepped onto the loose wooden plank beside her bed and heard something shift. Beneath the floorboard, nestled in the dark, was a worn envelope sealed with a strange crest, her family's crest. No stamp, no sender, just her name in slanted script, Eleanor Grace. Her heart pounded as she opened it, revealing an aged sheet of parchment that trembled in her hands. The handwriting was old and shaky, and at the bottom sat a signature she hadn't seen since childhood, her grandfather's. It was a will, not the one the town had seen when he passed. The simple document that left her the cabin and nothing else. This was different. This was handwritten, secret, and powerful. Her eyes raced across the lines, each word heavier than the last. It said the land from the ridge to the riverbank, the heart of Hollow Creek, belonged to her. Her grandfather had kept it quiet, hidden it from greedy relatives, corrupt lawyers, and the town that had turned its back on them after her parents died. Half the valley, once dismissed as worthless, had become prime real estate. And now, it was hers. Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat there in silence as the rain began to fall outside, the sound of it tapping on the tin roof like a slow revelation. That night, by the dim glow of a single lamp, she folded the will carefully and placed it back beneath the floorboard. The world hadn't changed, not yet. But it would. She would walk into town like she always did, her shoes still worn, her coat still thin. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. She was no longer just a poor orphan teacher. She was the rightful heir to Hollow Creek Valley. And soon, they would all know. The next morning, the town looked the same, but something had shifted inside Eleanor. As she passed by the row of shops, the same murmurs brushed past her ears. She smiled politely, hiding the fire that had begun to burn beneath her calm face. For years, they had watched her walk this path as if she were invisible. But now, every step she took was rooted in something solid: ownership, heritage, power. She arrived at the schoolhouse as always, unlocking the door, sweeping the dust, and laying out the day's lessons. But her mind wandered, not to arithmetic or spelling drills, but to the letter tucked safely beneath her bed. A letter that had the power to shake every pillar of Hollow Creek. By week's end, she'd made the quiet journey to Cooper and Sons, the only law office in town. The senior partner, Mr. Lawrence Cooper, was an old man with milky eyes who had known her grandfather. When she handed over the envelope, his face turned the color of clay. He read each word 3 times, his hands trembling, until he finally leaned back in silence. No one had expected this. The last will on record had been filed by a distant cousin and had awarded the more valuable lands to people long gone from the valley. But this letter changed everything. It was dated, signed, sealed. And more importantly, it had never been revoked in legal terms. Eleanor's document was now the standing will of record. In human terms, it meant she owned nearly 500 acres across Hollow Creek. Prime land, land under which mineral rights had been quietly sold off, leases granted, profits made. She didn't need to do anything loud or public to shake the valley. She just had to prove the will. And Cooper offered to do it for free, out of loyalty to her grandfather. That very afternoon, the lawyer filed a motion in the county office, submitting the letter as a binding will. The moment it was recorded, the valley's undercurrent began to crack. News traveled fast. It wasn't the kind of gossip that was whispered with amusement. It was panic disguised as disbelief. The Miller family, who thought they had inherited orchard rights, were now being told their leases were invalid. The mayor, who had been lobbying to build a small resort, discovered the land he promised was no longer his to give. And the banker, who once refused Eleanor a loan for school repairs, was stunned to learn that the building stood on land that was now legally hers. Within days, Hollow Creek transformed. Invitations Eleanor had never received now flooded her mailbox. A seat on the town council, a scholarship committee, property developers, and oil men suddenly remembered her name. But Eleanor said nothing. She accepted none of it. Not yet. She still wore the same clothes, taught the same children, and climbed the same narrow path home. But every evening, as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, she sat by her window and watched the valley below, her valley, the place that had ignored her, rejected her, mocked her. Now it all belonged to her, piece by piece, deed by deed. She knew the town would not yield easily. Power is never given up without resistance. But Eleanor was not after revenge. She wanted something more lasting. She wanted dignity, not just for herself, but for every student who sat at her desk, with holes in their shoes and hunger in their stomachs. With her new inheritance, she could rewrite the future of Hollow Creek. But first, she would have to face the same people who called her poor, and make them hear her voice, not with anger, but with authority. And that moment was coming closer than they realized. The town hall meeting was set for Friday evening, and the air around Hollow Creek grew heavier with every passing hour. Everyone was talking, from the butcher wrapping up fresh game to the preacher in his polished boots. All tongues buzzed about the orphaned teacher and the land that now belonged to her. For years, they had pushed her to the margins of every decision, never considering that someone so quiet, so plain, could one day rise to a place where her signature would carry more weight than their titles. But now, their projects were paused, their control shaken, and Eleanor Grace was walking toward them, holding the kind of truth that didn't need a raised voice. It had paper, proof, and power. The town hall was packed before dusk. Men who once scoffed at her filed into seats with stiff collars and folded arms. Women who once clucked their tongues now leaned forward with painted smiles, trying to catch Eleanor's eye. She entered without fanfare, wearing the same black coat she'd worn every winter. Her hands held no speech, no declaration, only a slim leather-bound folder, the edges smoothed by her careful fingers. When she took her seat near the front, the room quieted, not out of respect, but out of confusion. No one knew what she would say. They only knew she had every legal right to be there, and that terrified them. The meeting opened with the usual agenda: permit renewals, updates on bridge repairs, and seasonal budgeting. But the elephant in the room could no longer be ignored. The mayor, red-faced and sweating beneath the warm lights, finally brought it up. "It's come to the council's attention," he began, "that recent property claims have emerged involving Miss Eleanor Grace." The words stumbled out, couched in uncertainty and forced diplomacy. He mentioned the will, the land, the legal proceedings now pending. He tried to minimize it, but everyone could hear the fear beneath his voice. When the mayor invited her to speak, Eleanor rose slowly. She didn't approach the podium. She didn't raise her voice. She simply opened her folder and began to read aloud from her grandfather's letter. Every word echoed through the room like a bell tolling for pride and presumption. The document didn't just transfer land. It told a story of a man who watched his family's name get buried under politics and greed. A man who knew his granddaughter would carry the weight of that legacy, not with vengeance, but with wisdom. When she finished, she looked up at the room. For the first time in her life, the town looked back at her not as a poor schoolteacher, but as someone who could not be dismissed. The silence was deep. No one clapped. No one sneered. It was the silence of reckoning. The kind that comes when truth dismantles everything built on falsehoods. Eleanor did not demand compensation. She did not threaten eviction or raise rent on tenants. Instead, she offered calm clarity. The land was hers. But she had no interest in tearing down the town that raised her. What she wanted was a say, a seat at the table, a voice that mattered. And most of all, she wanted every child under her care to grow up in a town where goodness wasn't mistaken for weakness. As she left the hall, the crowd parted without words. She walked home beneath the moonlight, past fences and farms and hills that were now rightfully hers. But she didn't walk with triumph. She walked with purpose. For Eleanor Grace, the inheritance was never about wealth. It was about rewriting her place in a town that had written her off too soon. The days that followed brought a quiet ripple through the valley, one that couldn't be heard, only felt. People still gathered at the diner and lingered on porches. But the way they spoke Eleanor's name had changed. It wasn't ridicule anymore. It was caution, curiosity, and something resembling respect. She returned to her classroom as if nothing had happened, chalking math problems on the board and helping a boy tie his worn-out boots. The children never saw her differently, and that was the part she treasured most. Their eyes didn't measure worth by bank accounts or land deeds. They saw only kindness. And that was a kind of wealth she had carried long before the will was ever opened. But not everyone in Hollow Creek was ready to let go of old power. Behind closed doors, certain families who had profited from the land began to meet in hushed panic. Lawyers were called. Old contracts dug up. They clung to their influence like it was slipping through their fingers. One such man, Wallace Braxton, had leased mineral rights beneath Eleanor's land for over a decade. He had paid pennies for them, assuming the land would never be contested. Now, with her ownership verified, those rights were under scrutiny. And Braxton knew if Eleanor wanted, she could stop his operations cold. But Eleanor made no demands. Instead, she walked the edge of the valley one afternoon, stopping where the creek split the property and flowed west. She stood there a long time, staring across the water, as if weighing something only she could understand. When she returned home, she wrote a letter, her handwriting steady, her tone measured, and delivered it herself to the courthouse. In it, she proposed a compromise. Current leases would remain valid for one more year, with new terms to be negotiated that reflected fair value and supported local development. Her only condition was that a portion of those revenues be funneled into a trust for education, infrastructure, and children's welfare across Hollow Creek. The letter reached every corner of town. Some were relieved. Others were stunned. A few were embarrassed. But what none could deny was that Eleanor Grace had handled more power with more dignity than any of them ever had. She didn't raise her voice or flex her ownership like a sword. She used it as a tool to build, not to break. Meanwhile, the school board, once distant and dismissive, now scrambled to catch up. They invited her to speak at their next meeting, offered her a leadership role in shaping the curriculum. The same principal who once ignored her requests for new supplies now praised her insight. Eleanor accepted their invitations with quiet grace, never mentioning the years of being overlooked. She had no interest in dragging anyone through the mud. She was planting seeds, not just in the ground, but in the minds of the next generation. By the time winter crept into the valley and frost kissed the windows of her classroom, a new sentiment was taking root. People had stopped seeing her as the poor orphan teacher on the ridge. They now spoke of her as the woman who could have taken everything, but chose instead to give something back. She hadn't just inherited land. She had inherited a legacy, and she was rewriting it, not with greed, but with generosity. At night, Eleanor stood at her cabin window, watching the stars blink over her valley. She thought of her parents, of her grandfather, and the years she spent alone yet not defeated. The town was changing, slowly, painfully, but it was changing, and it started because one woman refused to let her worth be defined by what others could see. The thaw of spring brought new colors to Hollow Creek Valley. Blossoms opened slowly across the hills Eleanor now owned, their petals soft and unbothered by the past. But while the land began to bloom, the hearts of the townspeople were only just starting to thaw. Change, no matter how welcome, unsettled old roots. And as Eleanor quietly steered the valley's course toward fairness, A few still clung to the past with desperate hands. There were murmurs in certain corners of resistance, of ways to push her out using obscure legal tactics or social pressure. But none of it stuck. Every move made against her only revealed more clearly how much the old ways had relied on silence and submission. Eleanor offered neither. She spent her days the same as before, teaching with the same love and patience as when she had nothing but chalk and candles. But now, after the bell rang and children ran home, she often met with land surveyors, planners, and trustees. Her cabin, once thought to be the loneliest place in the valley, had become the center of decisions that would shape generations. Yet she never grew proud. Her boots still tracked the same dust, and her meals remained simple. Her strength was not in luxury. It was in how she carried herself, without needing to prove anything to anyone. One afternoon, she visited the old barn near the riverbank, a place forgotten by time. The roof sagged, and vines crept over the wooden slats. But it stood on land once part of her grandfather's first property. Inside, she found remnants of an older world, rusted tools, brittle ledgers, and a family photograph half faded by sun and memory. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers brushing the edges of the past. It reminded her why she had come back, why she had stayed. The valley was not just land. It was a memory, a promise, and a burden. But now, it was also her responsibility. Rather than selling parcels or raising rent, Eleanor announced a foundation in her grandfather's name. Its mission was simple: preserve the valley, support education, and ensure no child went to school hungry or cold. She gave back what she could have hoarded, and in doing so, she earned more than ownership. She earned trust. The same people who once judged her now listened, not because she demanded it, but because she had become impossible to ignore. The foundation's first project was rebuilding the town library, a place that had fallen into neglect. With her funding and oversight, it reopened as a bright, welcoming space filled with new books, study corners, and a children's reading room. Eleanor visited every weekend, reading to groups of young minds who had once been taught in a classroom with cracked windows and broken chairs. They listened to her not just as a teacher, but as a woman who had turned misfortune into movement. In time, the whispers about her grew quiet. People stopped calling her poor and started calling her Miss Grace again, but this time with reverence. And yet, she remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. She still walked the same ridge, still lit the same lamp each night, and still ended each day in silence, listening to the wind sweep across the land that had once belonged to everyone but her. Now it was hers, but she had made sure it was never hers alone. As the sun dipped once more beneath the ridges of Hollow Creek, the valley didn't just look different, it felt different. And somewhere in the quiet twilight, a legacy was being rewritten, not with gold, but with grace. Summer came with golden heat and ripened orchards, stretching long days across Hollow Creek Valley. It was the season when the town hosted its oldest tradition, Founders' Day, a fair of sorts, with food stalls, children's races, and speeches from local leaders meant to honor the past. For years, Eleanor had stood quietly at the edges of this gathering, clapping politely for names that were never hers. She brought her students to enjoy the games, then quietly slipped away, before the crowd toasted to those who had shaped the valley. But this year, something was different. The invitations came early, not just one, but many, from the mayor's office, the historical society, and even the bank that once refused her a loan. They asked her to attend as an honoree, to speak, to stand on the very stage that had once belonged only to men in fine hats and women with pearl gloves. She didn't respond at first. She had never sought applause. Her work wasn't finished. But then she remembered the children, her students past and present, who might see in her reflection a path forward, not one paved in bitterness, but in quiet resilience. And so she agreed. On Founders' Day, the town square was dressed in bunting and sunflowers. Families gathered under the oak trees. The same shop owners who once talked behind her back now lined up to shake her hand. She climbed the steps of the stage slowly, not with nerves, but with the calm of someone who had already survived far worse than silence. When she faced the crowd, she didn't hold a speech. She spoke from memory, from heart. She told them about her grandfather, about the letter beneath the floorboard, about the years she spent with torn shoes and full classrooms. and how the value of a person cannot be measured in what they wear or where they live. She thanked the valley, not for what it had given her, but for what it had taught her. She reminded them that land is just land until someone uses it for something greater. That a title means nothing unless it lifts others up. The applause wasn't loud. It was steady, real, a standing ovation not for wealth, but for wisdom. The children cheered loudest of all. In the weeks that followed, Hollow Creek began to transform, not from her money, but from her example. Young girls who once kept their dreams small now dared to dream big. Parents started attending school board meetings with fresh eyes. More children than ever showed up to the newly renovated library, some walking for miles just to hear her read. And Eleanor? She kept teaching, kept walking that ridge path every morning. Her boots still worn, her coat still plain. Years passed. People came and went. But the valley remained, and so did her legacy. Her name was stitched into scholarships, carved into wooden benches beneath pine trees, and whispered in lullabies sung by mothers who once sat in her class. She had been called poor, forgotten, dismissed. But in the end, she had inherited far more than land. She inherited respect, purpose, a future that reached far, beyond deeds and borders. And so the valley watched her every evening as she lit her lantern, its glow spilling gently across the hills like a quiet promise. A reminder that the orphaned teacher, who once owned nothing, now held everything that mattered. Not because she took it, but because she built it, acre by acre, child by child, with the unshakable strength of a heart that never gave up.